Tent Worms by Tennessee Williams. Billy Foxworth had been grumbling for days about the tent worms that were building great, sagging canopies of transparent gray tissue among the thickly grown berry trees that surrounded their summer cottage on the Cape. His wife, Clara, had dreams and preoccupations of her own, and had listened without attention to these grumblings. Once in a while she had looked at him darkly and thought, if he but knew, he has more to worry about than those tent worms. Tent worms? What are tent worms? She once murmured dreamily. But her mind wandered off while he defined them to her. He must have gone on talking about them for quite a while, for her mind described a wide orbit among her private reflections before he brought her back to momentary attention by slamming his coffee cup down on the saucer and exclaiming irritably, "Stop saying, 'Yes, yes, yes,' when you're not listening to a goddamn word I say." "I heard you," she protested crossly. "You were maundering like an old woman about those worms. Am I supposed to sit here starry-eyed with excitement while you—" "All right," he said. "You asked me what they were, and I was trying to tell you." "I don't care what they are," she said. "Maybe they bother you, but they don't bother me." "Stop being childish," he snapped. They had a sun terrace on the back of their cottage where Clara reclined in a deck chair all afternoon, enjoying her private reflections, while Billy worked at his typewriter on the screened porch just within. For 5 years, Clara had not thought about the future. She was thinking about it now. It had become a tangible thing once more, owing to the information she had to which Billy did not have access, in spite of the fact that it concerned Billy even more than herself, because it concerned what was happening to Billy that Billy did not or was not supposed to know about. No, he did not know about it. She was practically sure that he didn't. Or if he did, it was only in his unconscious, kept back there because he refused to accept it or didn't even dare to suspect it. That was why he had become so childish this summer, wandering like an idiot about those worms when it was August and they would be leaving here soon, going back to New York. And certainly Billy would never come back here again, and she, God knows, let the worms eat the whole place up. Let them eat the trees and the house and the beach and the ocean itself as far as she was concerned. But about 3 o'clock one afternoon she smelled smoke. She looked around and there was Billy, with a torch of old newspapers, setting fire to the tent worms' canopies of webby gray stuff. There he was in his khaki shorts, holding up a flaming torch of newspapers to the topmost branches of the little stunted trees, where the tent worms had built their houses. He was burning them out, childishly, senselessly, in spite of the fact that there were thousands of them. Yes, looking over the trees from the sun terrace, she could see that the tent worms had spread their dominion from tree to tree till now. Finally, near the end of the summer, there was a tree that did not support one or more of those gray tissue canopies that devoured their leaves. Still, Billy was attempting to combat them single-handed with his silly torches of paper. Clara got up and let out a loud cry of derision. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm burning out the tent worms," he answered bravely. "Are you out of your mind? There are millions of them." "That's all right. I'm going to burn them all out before we leave here." She gave up, turned away, and sank back in her deck chair. All that afternoon the burning continued. It was no good protesting. although the smoke and the odor were quite irritating. The best that Clara could do was drink, and so she did. She made herself a thermos of Tom Collins's, and she drank them all afternoon while her husband attacked the insects with his paper torches. Along about 5 o'clock, Clara Foxworth began to feel happy and carefree. Her dreams took a sanguine turn. She saw herself that winter in expensive mourning, in handsomely tailored black suits with a little severe jewelry, and a cape of black furs, and she saw herself with various escorts, whose features were still indistinguishable, in limousines that purred comfortably through icy streets, from a restaurant to a theater, from a theater to an apartment, not yet going to nightclubs so soon after. Ah, her attitude was healthy. She was not being insincere and pretending to feel what she didn't. Pity? Yes, she felt sorry for him, but when love had ceased being 5 or 6 years ago, I make an effort to think it would be a loss. Toward sundown, the phone rang. It rang so rarely now that the sound surprised her. Not only she, but their whole intimate circle of friends had drawn back from them into their own concerns. As actors dispersed to their offstage lives when a curtain had fallen and they're released from performance. She took her time about answering, having already surmised that the caller would be their doctor. And it was. Professional cheer is uncheering. How's it going, sweetie? How's what going? Your escape from the poisonous vapors of the metropolis. If that's a serious question, Doc, I'll give you a serious answer. Your patient is nostalgic for the poisonous vapors, and so is creating some here. What? What? Is the connection bad? No, just wondered what you meant. I will enlighten you gladly. Billy, your patient, is polluting the air of our summer retreat by burning out something called tent worms. The smoke is suffocating, worse than carbon monoxide in a traffic jam in a tunnel. I'm coughing and choking, and still he keeps at it. Well, at least he's still active. Oh, that he is. Would you like me to call him to the phone? No, just tell him I... No, don't tell him I called. He might wonder why. Why in the hell didn't you tell him so he'd know? And she didn't know how to complete her protestation, so she cried into the phone. I can't bear it. It's more than I can bear. My mind is full of awful, awful thought. Speculations about how long I'll have to endure it. When will it be finished? Easy, sweetie. Easy for you, not me. And don't call me sweetie. I'm not a sweetie. There's nothing sweet about me. I've turned savage. Unless he stops burning those tent worms, I'm gonna go. Alone. Back to the city. At least no diseased vegetation and paper torches. And him staggering out there. Gotta hang up. He's coming toward the house. Clara, it's hard to be human, but for God's sake, try. Can you tell me how to? Write me a prescription so that I can. She glanced out the picture window between the phone and the slow, exhausted return of Billy toward the sun deck, which the sun was deserting. Clara, love takes disguises. Your mind is probably full of fantasies that you'll dismiss with shame when this ordeal is over. You scored a point there. I'm full of fantasies of a bit of a future. You mentioned a prescription. Yes. What? Recollection of how it was before. Seems totally unreal. Right now, yes, but try to. Thanks. I'll try to breathe. If only the sea wind would blow the smoke away. When she returned to the sun deck, he had completed his exhausted return. He had a defeated look, and he had burned himself on several places, and applied poultices of wet baking soda, which smelled disagreeably. He took the other sun chair and pulled it a little away from where his wife was reclining, and turned it so that she wouldn't look at his face. Giving it up? She murmured. Ran out of paper and matches, he answered faintly. There was no more talk between them. The tide was returning shoreward, and now the smooth water was lapping quietly near them. Tent worms, she said to herself. Then she said it out loud. Tent worms. Why are you shouting about it? It's nothing to shout about. A blight on vegetation is like a blight on your body. This is just a place rented for summer and will never come back. A man in his youth is like a summer place, he said in such a soft, exhausted voice that she didn't catch it. What was that? He repeated it to her a little louder. Then she knew that he knew. Their chairs remained apart on the sun deck as the sun disappeared altogether. As dark falls, a pair of long companions respond to the instinct of drawing closer together. Unsteadily, she rose from her deck chair and hauled it closer to his. His scorched hand rested on his chair arm. After a while, the sentimental moon risen from the horizon to replace the sun's vigil, she placed her hand over his. A chill wind of shared apprehension swept over the moonlit sun deck, and their fingers wound together. She thought of their early passion for each other, and how time had burned it down, as he attempted to burn the tent worms away from their summer place, to which they, no, would never return, separately or together. Circa 1945, published 1980. Something about him. Tennessee Williams. There was something about him. Something they didn't like. They didn't know what. Mrs. Archie Henderson made a further analysis than most when she said that he was too oily. He acted like a new preacher on his first Sunday. You know, trying to please everybody, but so dreadfully afraid that that his politeness was almost gruesomely excessive, ducking jerkily up and down at the front door and wringing hands so fiercely that the married ladies' rings cut into their fingers. And they whispered afterward among themselves, "What a strong personality." But Haskell wasn't a preacher. He was just an ordinary dime-a-dozen grocery clerk. There were Haskells in Granada, and also a family of Haskells down near Biloxi. However, none of these were related to him, not even remotely, it seemed. He had no family connections whatsoever. This might have been forgiven the way things are nowadays, but... Well, for instance, one Monday morning, Mrs. Archie Henderson came into the shore with her 10-year-old daughter, Lucinda. Fat runs in the Henderson family, and Lucinda was right in the family tradition. She was very, very plump and buck-toothed and had committed the indiscretion that Monday morning of hanging a necklace of purple clover about her scarcely visible neck. Mrs. Henderson was extremely self-conscious about the child's appearance, or lack of it, and people who knew her tactfully mentioned nothing about Lucinda except her reported skill at domestic science. But Haskell didn't know this, and so he decided to compliment Lucinda on her chain of purple clover. He touched it delicately with his finger and exclaimed, "How pretty! How awfully pretty that is!" Mrs. Henderson glared at him suspiciously. "Yes, pretty. Give me 2 bars of Waltka's Extra Family Soap." When he had fetched her the soap, she jerked Lucinda's arm roughly and marched straight out of the store. Mr. Oliphant Owens, the boss, came over to Haskell's counter. "What did she get sore about?" "Why, nothing, not a thing," said Haskell. "Of course not." Mr. Owens gave him the same look that customers gave him. Puzzled, uneasy, a little bit hostile. "There is something about him," thought Mr. Owens. "Something that I don't like." But he couldn't decide what it was. On Saturday afternoons, Haskell was off, and he went to the public library. He sat down in a secluded corner and polished his glasses meticulously for several minutes, and then opened a volume of modern verse. He would alter his position frequently without ever removing his eyes from the book. It was like he was steering around hazardous turns in an auto race. You know, his body bent stiffly forward, his neck extended so that the cord stood out, and little crystal beads of sweat coming forth on his forehead, and even his fingers clenched on the sides of the book. Yes, it was ludicrous looking. Not because Haskell himself was homely. He wasn't. His features were quite regular, and his figure was nicer than most of the non-athletic type. Except for these eccentric manners of his, he might have been called good-looking. "What is it about him?" asked Miss Rose, who was the assistant librarian. "Nobody seems to like him, but I think he's nice." "Oh, I wouldn't hold that against him," said Miss Rose. "I think it's refreshing to see a man who is careful about little things. And heaven knows those red marks on your nose that you get from wearing glasses do look pretty awful." Miss Jameson's animosity became more defined as Miss Rose warmed in his defense. "If glasses are properly adjusted," she snapped, "they don't make ridges. I take mine to the opticians whenever I go to Memphis and have them refitted free of charge." "He reads good books," said Miss Rose. "I think his taste in poetry is extremely queer." "Well, it is unusual," said Miss Rose, "for anybody to read modern verse, least of all a clerk in a grocery store." "A clerk in a grocery store is unusual as a subject for conversation," said Miss Jameson. "I personally am not interested." However, Miss Rose was. She concluded that she liked Haskell, and only through saying it once or twice to herself the idea became firmly fixed in her mind, so that now when he entered the library Saturday morning she gave him her pleasantest, slightly worn smile and made some little remark about the weather, which, however unimportant, was always given an accent of sprightly concern. "Such brilliant sunlight this morning." "Yes, isn't it, though?" Or else she would say, "It's terribly cloudy. I should have brought my umbrella." And Haskell agreed. "Yes, it is cloudy. I guess I should have brought mine." One Sunday morning, she saw him go into the First Presbyterian Church. She made plans all that week, and the following Sunday she went there herself, wearing a brown tweed jacket with a little corsage of rosebuds and the lilies of the valley fastened on the lapel. She glanced about her discreetly as the service commenced, but he wasn't there. She felt quite terribly let down. Miserable, in fact. She fastened her eyes on the stained glass picture of the shepherd Jesus and composed her face with marvelous fortitude as she began to feel once more, gnawing voraciously under the tweed and crisp linen, under the charming corsage of pink and white flowers, that fox-toothed loneliness which always plagued her when she was not occupied with books and rubber stamps and ink pads and yellow library cards. The following Saturday, something miraculous happened. Haskell sneezed violently as he stepped in the library door. "You have a bad cold," said Miss Rose. "Yes, my room is so draughty," said Haskell. "I have had one continual cold all winter." "Oh, goodness. You ought to move." "I've thought of moving," he said, "but I can't find a place near the store." "Oh, now I wonder." "Yes?" "Mrs. Stovall's got a vacant room on her third floor, and it's just exactly 1 block from where you stay now." "Is that right? How fortunate. I wonder if you could give me this lady's address." "Of course," she laughed breathlessly. "It's where I stay." "Oh, indeed." His voice assumed an almost girlish falsetto. "Now that makes it very, very nice indeed." She wrote the address on a slip of paper. Her fingers trembled so it was scarcely legible. "You'd better see Mrs. Stovall right away," she advised. "Oh, I shall. I'll make inquiries at once." He went away from the desk, then had to return for his book. In her confusion, she dropped it, and Haskell said, "Pardon, I beg your pardon." She whispered, "Not at all." Her voice died away very oddly. She cleared her throat. She learned from Mrs. Stovall that evening that Haskell had paid $5 down on the room and would move in the first of the month. Soon afterward, and without acknowledging to herself any special reason, she went to the Delta gift shop and purchased an exquisite French negligee of shell-pink crepe de chine, with a froth of ivory lace at the throat and sleeves. That night, when she was alone in her room, she slipped it on and stood in front of the long oval mirror. It created a new Miss Rose, not one who was employed at the Blue Hill Public Library, but one who danced all night in open pavilions, laughed recklessly in Mediterranean moonlight, and won huge sums, they said, at roulette in the gambling casino. It was the 1st of March when Haskell moved in. They were very constrained at first, when they met in the hall or on the stairs. They both laughed nervously and edged unnecessarily close to the wall to prevent their clothes from touching. Miss Rose went on with her dreams and her speculations. One morning, she stood just on the inside of her door till she heard him descending the stairs from the 3rd floor. Then she caught the creamy lace about her throat and stepped out of her bedroom. She stood there in his full gaze for 3 ecstatic moments before she scurried into the bathroom with a slight hysterical giggle and locked the door, while Haskell proceeded unsteadily down the rest of the stairs. Already in early March, the Mississippi spring was well advanced. The trees were in leaf. There was a great deal of wind and rain which caused talk of high water and possible floods on the river. The mornings had an exceptional quality when it had rained all night and stopped at daybreak. The the clouds having thinned like smoke until they were gone altogether, except for some milky white threads which still clung like bits of shattered web to the pointed church steeples or tallest treetops. It was as though in the course of the night some radiant white cloth, like a bridal veil, had been drawn swiftly over the sky, and fragments of it had caught on these sharp projections and had been torn loose and held there. It must have been on a morning like this, said Haskell, that Robert Browning wrote that poem of his. God's in his heaven, you mean? All's right with the world? Yes, said Haskell. There was a pause, and then he asked, Do you agree about that? Mrs. Rose's heart leaped. I do sometimes, she murmured. I certainly do this morning. Occasionally, said Haskell, I have my doubts. The lark and the snail and the dew are not always convincing. Not always completely convincing. You know what I mean? He looked down at her very slyly, and something new came out of his eyes. It was almost full. It seemed to touch her cheek with little tentative fingers. A palpable, though very timid caress. Yes, I know what you mean, she breathed. He caught her elbow as she stepped over the curb. His touch, his slight upward gesture seemed to release from all effect of gravity, so that she felt as though she were floating with feathery lightness over the street. The laughter bubbled out of her lips irrepressibly, like water gone down the wrong way. At the opposite curb his pressure was resumed. She caught her breath. She was lifted up and blown forward, a thin tissue kite that was suddenly caught in a rising wind. My goodness, what weather, she cried. Isn't it marvelous, though? And then instead of turning at his usual corner, he walked up another block to the library steps and said goodbye to her there. And they both looked back at the same time and smiled as she entered the public library door. That heavy oak door with its foolish brass knocker and elaborate molding had never admitted her with so little resistance. It seemed to swing open from someone pushing inside. She stepped away to avoid a collision. But there was nobody but her. It was her own frail grasp that had drawn it so easily open. The room inside was wonderfully light and spacious. Brilliance was refracted from every surface, from the yellow oak tables and chairs, from ink pads and pencils, even from old Miss Jameson's knobby cheekbones. What alacrity! What spontaneous good humor she displayed all that morning to the library patrons! Miss Jameson watched her sourly and suffered from gas on the stomach. I tell you, he deliberately overcharged me 3 cents on the grits and 4 on the canned asparagus, shrieked Mrs. Austen. She drummed the grocery counter with her blue knuckles. 7 cents isn't much, but it just irritates me beyond all bearing to have somebody try to put something over on me like that, just as though I didn't know simple arithmetic when I've been keeping house and watching accounts for going on 30 years. When Haskell returned to the counter, he showed them conclusively that the mistake was not his. The mistake was in Mrs. Austen's own computations. But this only whetted her fury, so that when he had gone to the back of the store again, she leaned over the counter and whispered stridently to Mr. Owens, There is something about him that I don't like anyhow. I never did. And I'm not the only one that don't. I've heard others say the same thing. There's something about him that's just irritating to people. I just can't say what it is, but if I was you, Mr. Owens, I wouldn't truck him in this store. I'd have him out of here so fast it would make his head swim. Said Mr. Owens. The young man was neat, and courteous, and he was very reliable, but nobody seemed to like him. Haskell was given his notice that very next morning. While he was standing behind the butcher's huge white refrigerator, tying about his lean waist the immaculate strings of an apron, with fingers that were as delicate in their precision as the fingers of a young woman. "Sorry I have to let you go," said Mr. Owens. "You've done your work well, but you haven't made a good impression on the customers. You just haven't pleased them somehow. I've had several complaints." Haskell looked at him dumbly. "What?" "You heard me," said Mr. Owens. I can't keep you on here. I can't keep you here." He started to move away. Haskell followed. "Why don't they like me, Mr. Owens? What have they got against me?" Mr. Owens made an impatient gesture. "How should I know? It's something about you, I guess." He felt a curious relief when Haskell was gone, shouted good morning to all his customers with a heartiness that fairly rattled the canned goods off the shelves. Haskell went home at once and packed his valise. On his way to the station, he dropped in at the library to return a volume of Emerson's essays that Rose had taken out for him the night before. "Sorry I won't get to read them," he said. "I'm leaving town." "You're taking a trip?" she asked, trembling. "No, I'm leaving for good. I've lost my job." "Why? Why?" "I don't know why," he said. "Mr. Owens says it's something about me." A stranger came up to the counter and asked for a book of Edna Ferber's about pioneers. "Haskell," she called. But he had already gone out the library door. She saw his oddly shaped hat bobbing across the window. She would have pursued him except for the stranger's presence, his eyes fixed on her, pinioning her attention coldly like a blade thrust down on quivering, agonized wings. About noon, Miss Jameson came in and asked her what was the matter. She said she guessed that she had caught a spring cold. She didn't confess what had actually happened till about a week later, when Miss Jameson noticed Haskell's absence from his usual place on Saturday afternoon. "He's gone," said Miss Rose. "He got fired from the store and left town." Miss Jameson whinnied exultantly. "Gracious! Not even able to hold a clerical job!" "It wasn't his fault," said Miss Rose. "Well, maybe it wasn't his fault, but there was something about him that I didn't like. I don't know what it was, but I guess Mr. Owens must have felt the same way." "What was it?" demanded Miss Rose. "Well, it must have been partly the way he looked at you and smiled all the time and said how nice everything was, and you knew that he didn't mean a word of it." "Oh, but he did. He was sincerely anxious to please everyone." "Anxious. Yes, that's the word. That's nothing against him. It's nothing for him either." "People are just malicious," said Miss Rose. "I can't understand them. They're all so mean and malicious." She gave her colleague a look that included her so definitely in this general indictment that Miss Jameson moved nervously to the other end of the counter and hum a Scottish ballad off-key. During the night it had rained, and all morning it had cleared till now at the sun's meridian, or shortly thereafter. The air was as keen and brilliant as a polished blade is. There was not much warmth in it yet, but it was replete with sound and motion. Boxcars shunting about the freight yards, whistles screaming urgently, sparrows restlessly crossing the windows, dropping lime on the damp gray stone. At intersections, the traffic signals changing, and cars moving onward or halting. At 1:45, Miss Rose put on her tweed jacket, which she now wore every day, and walked to the corner drugstore for milk and a sandwich. In windows, she caught her image, angular, tall, her wrists too long for the sleeves of the brown tweed jacket. The hem of the skirt, yes, uneven. "Oh, God," she whispered. Milk and a cream cheese sandwich. Published 1946.